23 children were discovered locked in the basement of a Georgia plantation in 1864, all bearing the same distinctive features: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold. When Union soldiers forced open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, they found these children huddled together in darkness, some as young as 4, others approaching adolescence. The eldest, a girl of 13, told the officers something that made veteran soldiers physically ill. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mention the incident only once in a letter marked confidential and buried in regimental archives for over a century. Local histories of Burke County omit Thornhill Estate entirely, as if the plantation and its mistress never existed. But they did exist, and what Catherine Thornhill created in those 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. A systematic breeding program designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage because they were genetically tied to their owner. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she built in rural Georgia, I need you to do something. If you are hearing this story and it is making your skin crawl, imagine standing there in that cold cellar, the air heavy with damp clay and candle soot. Imagine hearing small voices whisper in the dark, "Mistress says we are her legacy." This channel dives deep into the darkest corners of American history, the stories they never teach in schools, the secrets buried in courthouse basements and forgotten military records. And I want to know where you are listening from. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you are in. Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let us find out together. Now let us go back to where it all began, to a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited the dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. The fields outside the main house were a dull red beneath a crust of frost, and the air smelled of wood smoke and debt. Crows hopped across the frozen rows as if searching for the last heartbeat in the soil. The wind cut through every gap in the old brick walls, carrying the scent of rot from the stables and the damp sweetness of decaying cotton bales stacked in the gin house. Thornhill Estate, once proud, stood exhausted under the pale sun. Inside the main house, a single fire struggled in the hearth of the study. The flames revealed dust on the wainscoting, cobwebs in the corners, and ledgers piled like tombstones on the mahogany desk. The room was silent except for the faint scratching of Catherine's pen as she wrote out the list of creditors that would soon own more of her life than she did. She was 28 years old, too young to be a widow and too proud to be pitied. Her black dress was neatly pressed, her auburn hair pinned tight at the back of her neck, but her eyes carried the pale green of cold iron. She stared at the columns of figures as if they were personal enemies. Jonathan Thornhill had been a poor steward and a worse husband. He inherited the plantation in 1838 with 42 enslaved workers, fine equipment, and manageable debt. Within a decade, gambling tables and reckless loans had drained it all. When the fever took him in February, the estate was mortgaged to its bones. The cotton fields yielded barely enough to feed the workers. Creditors in Augusta and Savannah circled, waiting for the moment to strike. Catherine sat in the study and realized that every gentle manner she had been taught as a girl meant nothing now. The world did not care how gracefully she poured tea. She closed the ledger and looked out the frost-rimmed window. Beyond the bare oaks, she could see the quarters where 31 souls remained. 11 men, 13 women, 7 children. 16 others had already been sold to keep the plantation afloat. She could almost hear their cries when the wagons took them away, though she had pretended not to listen. She thought of those remaining and the questions in their eyes. Would they be next? Would the Thornhill mistress sell them too? The lawyer from Westboro, Ambrose Talbot, had been blunt. Sell the estate and its workers to settle the debts, or find a way to make the land profitable again. He doubted there was any way to do so. The soil was tired, the price of cotton unstable, and the market glutted with new plantations in richer regions. His advice had been practical, his tone respectful, but every word tasted like failure. Sell, retreat to Augusta, and live modestly under her father's roof. Dependence. That was what he offered her, and that she could not bear. Catherine walked the property that afternoon. The overseer trailed behind her, his boots crunching over the frozen earth. The sky was the color of pewter. The slave quarters stood in 2 rows beyond the line of live oaks. Smoke drifted thinly from chimneys where scraps of pine burned low. Men moved like shadows among the sheds, patching fences, carrying feed, speaking in low voices that fell silent as she passed. She returned their glances with polite indifference, but her mind measured them differently. Strength, obedience, health. She was already cataloging the human assets she still owned, though she did not yet know what to do with them. That night she sat by candlelight in the same study where her husband had lost his fortune. The candle burned low, the air smelled of wax and despair. She poured a measure of brandy, opened a blank ledger and stared at the page until the ink blurred. If she sold the property, she would be a dependent again, a guest in her father's home, a burden disguised as family. If she tried to run it as her husband had, the land would devour her. There were too few hands, too much debt, and no money for more labor. Her breath clouded in the cold air. Then the idea came to her, not as a sudden flash, but as a slow unfolding, like frost spreading across glass. If she could not buy strength, she would grow it. The thought was monstrous and strangely elegant. She wrote a word on the top of the page, cultivation. Beneath it she wrote seedlings, rootstock, planting, harvest. Innocent words that masked her meaning. She would breed her labor force the way planters bred horses. Not haphazardly, but with control, selection, and record-keeping. She would create a generation of workers bound to Thornhill not only by law, but by blood. Children who would never be sold away because they were her descendants. They would love her because she would be their origin. In her mind, the plan gleamed like ice, cold, perfect, untouchable. She closed the book, locked it in the desk, and sat back. For the first time in weeks, she felt calm. Outside, the wind whistled through the chimneys. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked once and fell silent. Days later, she summoned the lawyer again. She spoke to him with the composure of someone who had already chosen her path. She would not sell. She would manage the estate herself. She would pay her debts within 5 years. Talbot raised his brows but said nothing. Widows had done worse things than try. After he left, Catherine began to observe the people on the plantation with new intent. She studied them at work, at meals, at prayer. She watched how they moved, how they carried weight, how often they fell ill. She took notes each night in the cipher she devised, replacing human names with agricultural terms. She began to see patterns where other people saw lives. Isaac drew her attention first. He was 24, born on the estate, tall and broad-shouldered, with quiet eyes that avoided confrontation. His wife had died of fever 2 years earlier, and he had no surviving children. The overseer called him reliable. Catherine called him rootstock one in her coded book. The decision settled in her mind like a stone dropped into still water. No sound, just ripples. On the evening of March 17th, she sent for Isaac. The house servants had already retired. The quarters were dark. She waited in the parlor, the candlelight turning her face to marble. When he entered, she dismissed the overseer and told Isaac to follow her upstairs. He obeyed without a word. What happened that night, she recorded only as first planting complete. Weather clear and mild. The next morning she took breakfast alone, composed and pale, and no one dared ask why she seemed different. In the weeks that followed, she continued her calculations. 3 weeks after the first encounter, she noted possible germination. By April, she wrote initial cultivation successful, anticipate harvest in December. Her tone in the book was the tone of a botanist, not a mother. The spring stretched over Thornhill like a thin blanket. The fields thawed, the enslaved returned to work, and the plantation's rhythm resumed its weary beat. But within the big house, something had shifted. Catherine began spending more time indoors, avoiding visitors. She dismissed the young maid who usually attended her, and took her meals privately. She told the overseer the heat bothered her, though the days were still cool. Richard Thornhill noticed. He was 16, pale and bookish, with a mind full of ideals that did not fit the world he lived in. He spent his time in the small library, reading philosophy, writing letters he never sent and dreaming of a kinder order. He had never liked his stepmother, but now his dislike ripened into unease. He watched her from doorways, noting the secrecy, the sudden fatigue, the way she avoided sunlight. He said nothing, but questions grew in him like weeds. By June, the entire household knew the widow was expecting. The gossip reached Wesboro and even Augusta. Catherine received a letter from her father expressing confusion and thinly veiled concern. She replied with a calm explanation that her late husband had not been as ill in January as people assumed. The child was his. Of course it was. She sealed the letter with wax and smiled as she pressed the stamp. That summer, the plantation came alive again. The cotton plants grew tall and green. The fields hummed with labor, and the air filled with the smell of sap and sweat. Catherine watched from the veranda, her hands resting on the swell beneath her dress. She felt the movement inside her as vindication. This was not sin, she told herself. It was innovation, a way to survive in a world that respected only strength and legacy. At night, she read medical texts and agricultural manuals, searching for words that would make her plan sound rational even to herself. She found comfort in the language of breeding stock, heredity, and improvement. She told herself she was building a future. Each entry in her coded journal reinforced the illusion. She wrote of the child as harvest one, and of herself as primary cultivator. She made neat charts of bloodlines and traits. The pages smelled faintly of ink and obsession. Autumn arrived with gold leaves and the dull ache of waiting. Catherine grew heavy, her face pale as parchment. The house servants spoke in whispers, wondering how such a pregnancy could have happened. No one dared ask directly. In the quarters, speculation took a sharper edge. Some guessed the father was one of the field hands. Others said it was a ghost, a curse, or something darker. The men avoided her gaze. The women crossed themselves when her name was spoken. One night in late November, lightning flashed across the horizon. Catherine went into labor as thunder rolled over the fields. The midwife, Miriam Grayson, arrived with her bag of instruments and herbs. She had delivered most of Burke County at one time or another, and asked few questions. The birth was long, hard, and silent except for Catherine's labored breathing. When it was over, a child's cry broke through the storm. A boy. The midwife washed him, wrapped him, and placed him in Catherine's arms. Pale green eyes, auburn hair with a streak of gold. Catherine looked down at him and saw the proof of her plan. 4 days later, Richard Thornhill was buried on the hill behind the family cemetery. The doctor had signed consumption as the cause of death. The neighbors sent flowers and polite condolences. Catherine wore black and wept gracefully. The juxtaposition was perfect. A funeral for one life, a christening for another. To the county, it was tragedy and miracle intertwined. To Catherine, it was symmetry. She named the child Jonathan after her late husband. She told anyone who asked that the baby had come early, which explained the unusual timing. Few cared to count months when the widow of Thornhill spoke with such composure. The lie settled easily into local gossip. People prefer stories that tidy themselves. Winter came again. Frost silvered the branches, and the plantation slept beneath the cold. Catherine returned to her ledgers, now with a renewed sense of purpose. She had done it. She had created life and disguised it as legacy. The debt still loomed, but her resolve hardened. This was only the beginning. By spring, she had recovered. The midwife continued to visit, bringing small gifts for the baby and receiving generous payment. She never spoke of what she had seen, only of the strange quiet in the mistress's eyes. Catherine began another journal, refining her cipher, adding new terms for pairings, traits, and generation yield. She recorded Isaac's eventual sale to a neighboring plantation in Alabama. His usefulness complete, his silence purchased with coin. She wrote his name in the margins beside rootstock retired. Then she closed the book and ordered new ledgers. Outside, life resumed. The fields filled with workers again, their songs low and rhythmic. The overseer barked orders. The cotton gins groaned. Children played in the dust near the quarters, their laughter rising into the heavy air. The plantation looked alive, but it was the life of a patient kept breathing by force. Catherine's plan grew in her mind like a second child. She thought in generations now, not seasons. If one child could be hidden beneath the veil of widowhood, more could follow. Each would strengthen Tuaiwa. The first planting. The winter faded slowly from Burke County, reluctant to loosen its grip on the land. For weeks the mornings remained brittle, the frost thick on the branches, the fields still gray with sleep. When the thaw finally came, it crept like a secret, one puddle at a time, one breath of damp air slipping through the shutters of Thornhill Estate. The cotton seeds waited in their sacks, the plows waited in the shed, and the world turned forward whether it was ready or not. In the main house, Catherine Thornhill watched it all with the calm precision of a chess player who had already moved her first piece. The infant slept in the cradle beside her writing desk, a quiet pulse in the room's dim air. She had named him Jonathan for her late husband, and that name had done its work, silencing questions and keeping the county's gossip satisfied. The midwife had gone home richer than she had ever been. The overseer knew better than to speak. The house servants whispered only in the kitchens, and even then in tones that carried more fear than curiosity. By the time the baby's first spring arrived, Catherine was once again writing in her coded journal. The entries were smaller now, more confident, the hand of a woman who had proved her concept. She had done what others would have thought unthinkable, and she had done it with elegance. She was already considering the next step, the second generation of what she called in her private mind the Thornhill cultivation. The plantation began to recover. Cotton plants rose green in the fields, and for the first time in years the overseer could report a respectable harvest. The debts were still heavy, but Catherine had learned to speak the language of creditors. A woman who carried herself with quiet dignity and arrived at the counting house with ledgers balanced and interest paid on time was not questioned too deeply. They saw only what she allowed them to see, a capable widow restoring her estate. But within the walls of the main house, a different kind of work was beginning. Catherine had begun observing two other men among the enslaved workers. Both were young, healthy, and obedient, though in different ways. The first, Thomas, was strong and cautious, careful with his words. The second, Samuel, was quicker in speech and movement, with the kind of energy that might breed well, as she phrased it in her cipher. She recorded their ages, their family histories, their physical descriptions, even their temperaments. Each man was listed under a coded designation, Rootstock 2 and Rootstock 3. Isaac had been Rootstock 1, the prototype. His sale to Alabama had been noted neatly in the margin beside the words Project Complete. Every evening, after the baby was asleep, she would sit at the desk with a glass of wine and her journal open, refining her calculations. She mapped the traits she desired, the intervals between conceptions, the pairings that would yield the strongest results. Her handwriting remained steady even as her thoughts grew darker. To her, the work was not evil. It was efficient. The same logic that governed crops and livestock could govern people, if only one had the will to apply it. Richard Thornhill, meanwhile, had grown quiet. His illness had weakened him through the winter, but by March he seemed to rally. The color returned faintly to his face. He took short walks on the veranda and tried to read again, though the words blurred. The servant said he looked better. Catherine said nothing. She served him soup herself each evening, spooning it carefully into his bowl, stirring the tonics prescribed by the midwife. He thanked her with soft gratitude that made her lips curl in private amusement. Sometimes he would speak of his father, of how the plantation might be restored if managed differently. He spoke of freeing certain workers one day, of hiring them back for wages, ideas that had come from the books he read. Catherine listened with polite patience as though humoring a child. She knew those ideas would never leave that room. The world he imagined had no place in Thornhill's future. In early April, a courier arrived from Augusta carrying a letter sealed in black wax. It bore her father's hand, written in a firm merchant's script. He had heard rumors, he said, of her unusual isolation, of her pregnancy, of her refusal to attend church or receive callers. He expressed concern for her reputation. She read the letter once, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the fire. The ash curled upward and was gone. She owed the world no explanations. Her legacy would speak for her in time. By May, Catherine was ready. She called Thomas to the main house under the pretense of repairing a loose hinge. The hour was late, the corridors quiet. She had prepared the room as she always did, the curtains drawn, the lamp turned low. When he entered, he kept his eyes on the floor. She told him what she required of him with a calm voice that allowed no misunderstanding. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. She saw fear flicker across his face and then resolve. He nodded once. He knew refusal was impossible. What happened that night she recorded in her journal with the same clinical detachment as before. Second planting completed. Rootstock 2 demonstrates suitable vigor. Anticipate successful yield. Outside, the summer heat settled over Burke County like a curse. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and sweat. The fields shimmered with heat. The workers bent double under the sun, their songs low and hollow. At night, the frogs sang in the ditches and the cicadas droned in the trees, a relentless chorus that filled the darkness. Life continued in its slow, grinding rhythm. The world at large had no idea that within Thornhill's walls, a new and terrible logic was taking root. By late summer, Catherine began to suspect that her second attempt had succeeded. Her body followed the same rhythm it had before. She marked the days in her ciphered ledger, her handwriting a steady march toward December. The midwife returned, silent and efficient, accepting the coins that bought her complicity. Richard watched from the upstairs hallway one afternoon as Mrs. Grayson left the house, her shawl pulled tight, her face unreadable. Something twisted in him at the sight. He remembered the earlier visits, his stepmother's secrecy, her illness that had not looked like illness. He began to suspect, though he could not yet name what he suspected. The autumn storms came early that year. Rain fell for days, turning the red clay roads to rivers of mud. The overseer complained that the wagons could not reach the gin house. Catherine ignored him. She had other matters to attend. On a cold night in early December, Thomas's child was born. A girl. The midwife delivered her quickly and quietly. Catherine named her Eleanor, after her mother, though she wrote in her journal only Harvest 2, female, healthy auburn hair evident at birth. She nursed the infant briefly, before sending her to a small room at the back of the house where one of the house servants would raise her. The mother, an enslaved woman named Grace, was given a week of rest before returning to work in the kitchens. She never spoke of what had happened. She had seen too much already. Catherine spent the winter dividing her attention between her two children, the boy and the girl. She taught herself to manage both the estate and her secret project with mechanical precision. She rose before dawn, inspected the barns, met with the overseer, and kept the books in immaculate order. At night, she returned to her desk, where the candlelight gleamed on the glass vials that held strands of hair and slivers of fingernail. Each vial bore a label, coded and dated. She called it her archive. In March of 1849, the first major creditor from Augusta arrived unannounced. Mr. Caldwell, a portly man with spectacles and a skeptical mind, intended to inspect his investment. He expected to find a woman on the brink of ruin. Instead, he found the estate orderly, the fields planted, the accounts in balance. He was impressed, and more importantly, he was reassured. Catherine entertained him with quiet hospitality, serving tea and speaking of crop rotations and rainfall, as though she had been born to the work. When he left, he told the lawyer, Talbot, that the Thornhill widow was a remarkable woman, industrious and practical. She smiled when she heard of his words. Let them think what they wished. The truth was a luxury she no longer needed. By the summer of 1850, Thornhill's reputation had begun to recover. The cotton yields improved, and Catherine's name appeared again in polite conversation. People called her reserved but capable. Some said she was lonely. Others whispered she had a lover hidden somewhere on the estate. No one suspected the truth, because the truth was too grotesque for imagination. That same summer, Richard began to see things that unsettled him. He noticed that Isaac, the field hand who had once been so prominent, was gone. The overseer said he had been sold, but Richard remembered how often Isaac had been summoned to the house before his disappearance. He noticed, too, how Catherine's manner changed when certain workers passed by. A flicker of recognition, a brief glance of possession. It stirred unease in him, a shadow of a thought he could not yet bring into light. Catherine sensed his restlessness and decided to remove the problem before it ripened. She increased the strength of his tonics. She instructed the cook to sweeten his tea with the syrup she kept locked in her cabinet. She told herself it was mercy. Richard had become an inconvenience, a relic of an old order that did not fit the world she was building. She watched him weaken again through the autumn. His cough returned, his appetite vanished, and his eyes grew dull with fever. He thanked her still for her care. Gratitude from the dying is the sweetest kind of silence. In her journal, she wrote only one sentence that November: obstruction diminishing, future secure. The following weeks passed in a haze of fog and rain. The plantation sank into a strange quiet. Even the birds seemed to avoid the sky above Thornhill. On the night of December 3rd, Richard Thornhill died in his bed. The physician from Wesboro came in the morning, looked at the pale body, and nodded gravely. Consumption, he said. A tragedy. Such a sensitive young man. Catherine wept appropriately, arranged the funeral with care, and wore mourning for the prescribed year. 4 days later, she gave birth again. Another boy, red-haired and pale, who cried with a sound that seemed to echo through the halls. She named him Samuel, after one of the men who had provided his lineage. The irony pleased her. She told everyone the child had been premature, and they believed her. No one in Burke County was inclined to question a woman who paid her bills on time and kept to herself. Through the early 1850s, Thornhill flourished. The debts diminished, the cotton thrived, and Catherine's breeding program expanded quietly beneath the surface of respectability. Each birth was recorded in her coded journal, each pairing noted with precision. The enslaved population grew from 31 to 40. Visitors remarked on the health of her workers, their orderly conduct, their loyalty. Catherine smiled and said little. They were loyal because they were hers in ways those visitors could not comprehend. The midwife's hands grew tremulous with age, but she continued her work. Attending the births, administering the tonics, collecting the vials for Catherine's archive. She never spoke of what she saw. The money was too good, and the consequences of disobedience too clear. By 1853, Catherine had 5 living children in the main house. Jonathan, Eleanor, Abigail, Margaret, and Samuel, all with her features, all with the same pale green eyes and the same hair that caught fire in sunlight. She kept them close, teaching them to read and write, to speak properly, to understand that their lives were special. They grew up believing they were orphans taken in by a benevolent mistress. They never questioned why they were forbidden to leave the house unaccompanied, or why the other children on the plantation looked at them with a mixture of fear and pity. Each night Catherine visited the heritage room, as she now called it. The shelves were lined with her journals, her vials, her charts. She stood in the flickering lamplight and traced the lines that connected names, the web of ancestry that she had created. It gave her a sense of immortality. She had become not just the mistress of Thornhill, but its architect, its god. In one of her later journals from that period, she wrote, "The experiment proceeds with excellent consistency. Rootstock selection effective. Behavioral conditioning successful. Projected self-sustaining population within 2 decades. Her handwriting never wavered. Outside, the world began to change. The 1850s brought talk of abolition, of territories, of war. But in Burke County, those were distant concerns. The cotton still grew, the sun still rose, and Thornhill's field still filled with the sound of picking and singing. Life went on, as it always had, beneath the weight of things unsaid. At night, when the house was silent and her children slept, Catherine would walk the corridors alone, her footsteps soft on the wooden floors. Sometimes she would pause by the nursery door and listen to the steady breathing within. She would think of the generations yet to come, of the hundreds of descendants who would carry her blood. It comforted her to imagine them spreading through the future like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unbreakable. In the quarters, however, the mood was different. Whispers passed from mouth to mouth, stories of what had been done, of children born with the mistress's eyes, of men summoned to the house and returning changed, their spirits broken. The older women prayed quietly at night, asking God to remember them, to see what was happening in this place forgotten by decency. They did not know how or when, but they believed that one day justice would come. For now Thornhill stood proud again, its columns gleaming white in the sunlight, its mistress serene and untouchable. Visitors saw only prosperity, a house reborn from ruin. None of them could have imagined the horror that had taken root beneath that beauty, the slow, methodical creation of a legacy written in blood. The first planting had succeeded. The experiment was alive, and Thornhill would never be the same again. The children of Thornhill, by the spring of 1854, Thornhill was alive again. The field stretched wide beneath a rising sun that painted the red Georgia soil in hues of rust and gold. Cotton buds glimmered like ghosts of snow, and travelers passing the estate would slow their wagons to marvel at how prosperous the plantation had become. What they could not see was the quiet pattern pulsing beneath that beauty. The pattern Catherine Thornhill had built with the precision of a scientist and the ruthlessness of a god. Within the main house, 10 children filled the corridors with small footsteps and muffled laughter. To any visitor, they were a miracle of charity, orphans rescued by a grieving widow. Catherine played the part to perfection. She dressed them neatly, fed them well, and taught them to read and write, something no one else in Burke County dared do for the enslaved. To the church women who sometimes visited out of obligation, she said that it was an act of Christian kindness. To herself, she called it preparation. Each child bore fragments of her reflection, a shade of her eyes, a curl of her auburn hair, a shape of her cheekbone. The resemblance pleased her. She would watch them at lessons, their faces tilted toward the sunlight, and feel something close to pride. She had succeeded in creating her own lineage, not of bloodlines preserved in ledgers and wills, but of flesh and bone, breathing proof of her dominion. She imagined a future where Thornhill would never again depend on outside labor, where every hand that worked the fields carried her mark. But the other children, those born in the quarters, those whose skin bore no trace of her own, they saw the difference. They saw how the house children, as they called them, ate better, slept in clean rooms, and were treated with a strange gentleness that was neither love nor kindness, but ownership refined into affection. The plantation was divided not by the color of skin, but by the nearness to Catherine's blood. It was a hierarchy that confused and frightened everyone who lived under her rule. By 1855, whispers moved through the quarters like wind through dry grass. The old ones said the mistress had gone mad. Others said she was working witchcraft. They spoke of her coded journals, her midnight walks, the way she collected locks of hair from every child she birthed. They spoke of the room in the east wing no one was allowed to enter, the one that smelled faintly of ink and sickness. The stories grew and twisted, as fear often does, until some believed that the mistress was trying to make herself immortal through her children's flesh. Catherine, of course, heard the murmurs. The overseer told her of them, his voice low with unease. She smiled and told him to increase the rations slightly, and to remind the people that loyalty was rewarded. Then that same night, she wrote in her journal, "Superstitions spreading. Emotional control measures required. Increased nutrition and rest cycles to preserve breeding stock integrity." It was all calculation. Compassion was simply a tool. The plantation continued to grow. 2 new cabins were built for the expanding population. A second barn was added. The cotton yield broke records. Visitors from Westboro came to study her methods, praising her for her efficiency. None of them saw the quiet horror that made that efficiency possible. None of them knew that every child in those cabins was being measured, charted, and planned for like livestock. Catherine's private world revolved around the children she called her first generation. Jonathan, now 8, was tall and quiet with her sharp eyes and the self-possession of a young heir. Eleanor, 6, was more curious, often found reading beside her mother's chair. Abigail and Margaret were smaller, delicate, obedient. Samuel, not yet 2, clung to his nursemaid with the stubborn innocence of infancy. Each night, after the lamps were out, Catherine would stand at the threshold of their nursery and study them sleeping. She would whisper to herself, "They are my future. They are Thornhill." But even the most meticulous design cannot account for what grows unseen in the human soul. Among the enslaved, resentment had begun to ferment. They saw their children paired like animals. They saw young women summoned to the house and returning silent, their eyes empty. They saw boys sold away without warning. Beneath the obedience that Catherine demanded, a quiet hatred took root, nurtured by grief and helplessness. It was not yet a rebellion. It was only the beginning of one. One night in late autumn, the overseer, Silas Kendrick, found a piece of paper nailed to the door of the smokehouse. It bore no signature, only a crude drawing of a tree with a woman hanging from its branches. Beneath it, in shaky letters, someone had written, "Justice will come for the mistress." Kendrick brought the note to Catherine at once, trembling. She read it without expression, then burned it in the hearth. "There will always be malcontents," she said calmly. "Remind them who feeds them." She increased the patrols that week and had the dogs sleep near the quarters. No one confessed and no punishment was issued. But after that night, the workers' songs in the fields grew softer, slower, filled with a sadness too heavy for words. Meanwhile, the children of Thornhill continued to grow under their mother's watchful eye. Catherine began teaching them lessons that no book contained: how to observe people, how to keep secrets, how to maintain order through fear disguised as kindness. She made them repeat phrases until they became truths. "We are one family. We are bound to Thornhill. Loyalty is survival." The younger ones repeated the words without understanding. The older ones began to sense something wrong in them, but were too afraid to question. In her coded journal, Catherine wrote, "Subject J exhibits strong leadership tendencies. Subject E demonstrates advanced reasoning and emotional sensitivity. Future pairings to be determined when maturity is reached." She called it research. The children called it life. By 1856, there were 10 of them, her chosen line. Jonathan was now 11, Eleanor 10, Abigail 9, Margaret 8, Samuel 6, William 5, Henry 4, Caroline 3, and 2 infants in the nursery. To the outside world, Thornhill had become a model of Southern prosperity. Visitors wrote admiringly of the estate's harmony, of how the workers seemed devoted to their mistress. No one asked why the songs from the fields had changed from hymns to dirges. The heritage room in the East Wing had grown as well. It now held 3 full volumes of Catherine's coded journals, shelves of labeled vials, and a large table covered with folded papers. On those papers, drawn in careful ink, were family trees, not of ancestry, but of design. Arrows connected names with notes about temperament and physical traits. It was the science of control, and at the center of every chart was her own name. Sometimes, when she stood in that room, she imagined that she was seeing into the future. She pictured generations of Thornhill children spreading across the land, all tied to her by blood. It made her feel powerful. It made her feel divine. But not everyone saw divinity in her work. The enslaved people whispered to each other in secret, passing the story like a curse. They called her the woman who breeds her own chains. They said her soul had turned to iron. They said God would send fire to Thornhill, and some began to believe that fire should come from their own hands. In the spring of 1857, one of the field women, Ruth, fell pregnant without Catherine's authorization. The father was a young man named Samuel, who had once been favored for his strength. When Catherine learned of it, her fury was cold and quiet. She summoned Mrs. Grayson, the midwife, and gave her simple instructions. What happened that day was whispered about for years. The screams, the blood, the silence afterward. Ruth survived, but she never spoke again. Her body lived. Her spirit did not. That night, Catherine wrote in her ledger, "Unauthorized conception terminated. Control maintained." Then she slept soundly. Jonathan, now old enough to understand fragments of adult conversation, began to notice the tension that filled the house. He saw the way the workers looked at his mother, not with respect but with a hatred so deep it frightened him. He saw the way Mrs. Grayson's hands shook when she was summoned. Once he asked his mother why people seemed afraid of her. Catherine smiled faintly and said, "Fear is the foundation of order, my son. Without it, the world falls apart." He accepted her words because he had been raised to. But a seed of doubt took root that night, a seed that would one day destroy everything. By 1858, Thornhill was more than a plantation. It was an experiment perfected. The workforce had grown to over 40. The children Catherine had borne now worked in the house or studied under her. The ones she had bred among the enslaved population labored in the fields. She kept charts of their progress, noting which lines produced the healthiest offspring. It was a living archive of her ambition. The world outside Thornhill was changing. The country was fracturing, but Catherine paid no attention. The talk of abolition, of war, of freedom meant nothing to her. She believed Thornhill existed beyond such chaos, that her system was eternal. She wrote, "Empires may fall, but the blood remains." The enslaved people saw it differently. They knew the world was shifting. Rumors of freedom drifted down from the north like faint music carried on the wind. The idea of liberation, impossible a decade before, began to take shape in their minds. Hope, once dangerous, became a quiet kind of defiance. And at Thornhill, where hope had been smothered for years, that defiance began to burn. One humid night in July, lightning struck a tree near the edge of the quarters, setting it ablaze. The fire was quickly contained, but the sight of it, the flames licking the sky, stirred something in everyone who saw. To the workers, it was a sign. To Catherine, it was an omen. She wrote that night, fire near the quarters, unexplained origin, reinforced discipline. But the fire had already begun in their hearts. Through the rest of that summer, the house seemed to pulse with tension. The children sensed it too. Eleanor, now 12, began to ask questions that made her mother's voice sharpen. Why are we not allowed to visit the others? Why do they look like us? Catherine dismissed her with a glance. Because you are not like them, she said. You are chosen. But in the nights that followed, Eleanor lay awake listening to the faint cries from the quarters, and doubt crept through her like a cold wind. By the winter of 1859, the first generation of Thornhill's children stood on the threshold of adolescence. Jonathan had become quiet and withdrawn. Eleanor's curiosity deepened into rebellion. Catherine felt the shift and responded the only way she knew, with control. She separated the children more strictly, imposed schedules, locked rooms. But control built from fear is fragile. It cracks from within. The new year arrived with heavy rains. The roads turned to rivers again, isolating Thornhill from the rest of Burke County. It was as if the world outside had vanished. Inside, Catherine's creation stood complete. A plantation reborn from ruin, thriving on blood, secrecy, and obedience. To the casual eye, it was perfect. To those who lived within it, it was a silent hell. That spring, Eleanor found herself standing before the locked door of the East Wing. She had never been inside, but she felt the pull of it, the mystery her mother guarded so jealously. She pressed her ear against the wood and heard nothing. But she smelled ink and oil and something faintly metallic. She did not yet know it, but that door would open soon, and what she would find inside would shatter everything she believed. Outside, the fields bloomed again, white with cotton. The songs rose and fell, carried by voices that had learned to hide their meaning. And in the house, Catherine Thornhill looked upon her children and smiled, believing her legacy was secure. But every seed carries within it the memory of fire. The Heritage Room. The year was 1859, and Thornhill stood like a temple of silence under the Georgia sun. The cotton fields swayed in the heat, whispering secrets only the wind could understand. The air smelled of soil and smoke, of sweat and iron. Inside the house, behind its gleaming white columns, Catherine Thornhill built her own cathedral to control, a room that would outlive her, or so she believed. The Heritage Room began as a whisper of an idea, a place to keep records, she told the servants. But in truth it was her sanctum. No one but she entered. Even Mrs. Grayson, who had seen things that defied words, was forbidden beyond that door. The room was windowless, lit only by oil lamps that burned low and steady, casting amber halos across the walls. Shelves lined the plaster, filled with her journals, each one bound in leather darkened by use. 3 volumes already, coded in the cipher only she could read, filled with the arithmetic of human lives. At the center of the room stood a large table covered in folded papers and vials. Each vial contained a lock of hair, labeled and dated, a fragment of the bodies she had bred and owned. Some belonged to her children, others to the women and men she had used for breeding. It was her ledger of lineage, her proof that she had transcended mortality. To her it was beauty, order carved from chaos. Each night, when the rest of Thornhill slept, Catherine came to the Heritage Room. She wore a black silk robe that whispered as she moved. She would light the lamps, open a journal, and trace her finger down the neat columns of coded entries. Harvest 3, male, strong build, pale eyes, compliant temperament. She would smile, then glance at the vials. She saw her own immortality reflected in them. There were moments when she stood before those shelves and felt something close to awe. She told herself she was doing what nature intended, perfecting the imperfect, taming the wild. She did not see the horror, only the symmetry. She imagined generations born from her blood, bound forever to Thornhill, unable to leave because their lineage was their prison. In that fantasy, she found peace. But outside the heritage room, the world was shifting. The whispers of war had become shouts. The newspapers from Augusta spoke of secession, of abolitionists, of blood in Kansas. The men at church talked of northern aggression and states' rights. Catherine listened with polite detachment. The world beyond Thornhill was a distraction. Her war was here, fought in secret, fought with lineage and silence. The plantation itself had grown to nearly 50 souls. The quarters had expanded, the barns rebuilt, and the fields extended farther into the red clay hills. Thornhill was prosperous again, and people in Westboro spoke her name with admiration. A remarkable woman, they said. A pillar of strength. None of them knew what those walls hid. The children had grown taller. Jonathan was 15 now, silent and obedient, his mother's image carved into a boy's body. Eleanor, 13, had inherited Catherine's intelligence but not her coldness. She asked questions, and too many questions. Abigail and Margaret were softer, pliant, reflections of what Catherine wanted all her daughters to be. The younger ones followed blindly, their world no larger than the house and the manicured yard around it. But there were cracks forming. The children began to sense that Thornhill was not like other places. They saw the way the workers looked at them, not with admiration but with hatred and sorrow. They heard the whispered prayers at night drifting through the open windows. And they noticed their mother's absences, the nights when she vanished into the east wing with her lamp and her key. One night Eleanor followed her. She crept barefoot down the hall, the wooden floor cold beneath her feet. She watched through the keyhole as her mother moved inside the heritage room, her shadow bending across the walls. She saw the shelves of books, the glass vials glinting in the lamplight, and the large family chart spread across the table. She saw her own name written in ink, connected by lines to others she did not recognize. She could not read the words, but she felt the wrongness in them, the chill of something monstrous disguised as order. She did not move until the lamp went out. When she slipped back into her bed, her heart was still pounding. She said nothing the next morning, but a new understanding had taken root inside her. Whatever her mother was building in that room was not meant to be seen by anyone else. Catherine, for her part, felt the shift in the air. She noticed the glances, the tension in her children's eyes. She tightened her grip, controlling every detail of their lives. Lessons began at dawn and ended at dusk. Every hour accounted for, every conversation monitored. But the more she controlled, the more the silence deepened. The house itself seemed to grow restless, the air thick with unease. Outside, the enslaved workers spoke quietly about what was coming. Word had spread that the country was breaking apart. Some said freedom was near, that the Yankees would come. Others were afraid to believe. But everyone felt the tremor of change, and everyone knew that if freedom did come, it would not come easily. Catherine wrote in her journal that summer, "External instability increasing. Reinforce internal structure. Prepare for long-term isolation if necessary." Her handwriting was steady, but her heart was no longer calm. The order she had built felt fragile, as if a single breath might shatter it. In August of 1860, she decided to expand the heritage room. She had the carpenters build a false wall, creating a hidden space behind the shelves. In that space, she kept the most delicate records, notes on her children's parentage, the true pairings, the bloodlines she had engineered. She hid the key in a hollow behind the mantel in her study. Only she and Mrs. Grayson knew where it was, and Mrs. Grayson would not live long enough to tell anyone. Ooh. The midwife's health was failing. Years of toil and guilt had eroded her strength. Her hands shook when she worked. One night she confessed to Catherine that she could no longer do it, that she could no longer bear the weight of their secret. Catherine listened in silence, then poured her a cup of tea laced with laudanum. Mrs. Grayson fell asleep in her chair and never woke again. Catherine wrote in her journal that night, "Assistant terminated. Liability neutralized." The following week she buried Mrs. Grayson on the edge of the property, near the creek where the soil stayed soft. No one asked questions. Death was common on plantations. Catherine wore black for a single day, then returned to her work. By the end of that year, the heritage room had become her entire world. She spent hours there each night, mapping new generations that had not yet been born, planning pairings for the future. The air inside grew heavy with the smell of ink and oil, the scent of obsession. her journals filled with words that no one would ever read. Project Thornhill approaching self-sufficiency. First-generation breeding candidates maturing. Predicted yield stable across variables. She no longer thought of people as people. They were components in a grand design. In her dreams, she saw Thornhill not as a plantation, but as a living organism. Breathing, multiplying, feeding on her will. She saw herself at its heart, eternal, unbreakable. She would wake with tears on her cheeks. Not of sorrow, but of triumph. But in the quarters, the prayers grew louder. The workers had begun to carve small symbols into the trees around their cabins. Crosses, circles, patterns of protection. They burned sage when the moon was full. They told their children to stay away from the house, to avoid the eyes of the mistress. Some began to believe that Thornhill itself was cursed, that the land drank too much pain to ever rest. Eleanor's curiosity deepened into defiance. She began sneaking into the library to read books her mother had forbidden. She read about freedom, about humanity, about sin and redemption. Each page widened the gap between her and the woman who had birthed her. She started writing her own notes in a small notebook she hid under her pillow. Not in code, but in plain words. She lies. She says we are family, but we are prisoners. One day, I will know everything she has done. Jonathan noticed the change in his sister. He tried to warn her. Do not anger her, he whispered one night. She knows everything. But Eleanor's eyes burned with something Catherine had never managed to break. The fire of conscience. Then let her know, she said. Let her know I see her. In early 1861, the country fractured. Georgia seceded from the Union and war followed. Soldiers marched through Burke County, and the talk of freedom turned to fear. But Thornhill remained untouched, isolated in its strange order. Catherine heard the cannon fire from distant battlefields and smiled. War would destroy the weak. She was not weak. She had built something that could not die. The Heritage Room became a shrine to her delusion. Each night she lit the lamps and whispered to the vials, "You are my legacy." Sometimes she spoke to the empty air, imagining the generations to come. "You will never leave me. You will carry my name in your blood." The walls seemed to hum with her madness. The children began to avoid the East Wing altogether. Even Jonathan, who had once worshipped her, grew afraid. He had seen the vials once when she left the door ajar, dozens of them glinting in the dim light. He had seen a label with his own name. After that night, he dreamed of glass breaking and blood spilling across the floor. Eleanor, now 14, could no longer stay silent. She wanted to know the truth. One afternoon, while her mother was away inspecting the fields, she found the hidden key. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door. The room was smaller than she imagined, but denser, heavier, as if the air itself were alive. She saw the journals, the vials, the charts. She saw her own name connected by a line to the name Thomas, one of the field hands. Her stomach turned. She turned another page and saw the word pairing. Then another and another. The full horror of her mother's design unfolded before her. She stumbled out of the room, sick and trembling. That night she confronted Catherine. "I know," she said. "I know what you are doing, what you have done." For the first time, Catherine's mask cracked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "You think you understand? You are too young to see the truth. I am saving us, Eleanor. I'm saving you. By enslaving us." Eleanor whispered. "By breeding us like animals?" Catherine's hand trembled, then steadied. "By making us eternal." The words hung in the air like a curse. That night, Eleanor wrote in her notebook, "She believes she is God. But God does not hide his work in darkness. One day the darkness will open." Outside, the first winds of war swept across Georgia. Soldiers marched, cannons rolled, and the world beyond Thornhill began to collapse. But within those whitewashed walls, another kind of war had already begun. One between mother and daughter, between creation and conscience. And in the heart of the house, behind a locked door, the Heritage Room waited. The lamps still burned low. The ink still glistened wet on the pages. The glass vials still held the hair of the living and the dead. The room had no windows, no sound, no mercy. It was the soul of Thornhill itself, and it would not rest until every secret it contained was paid for in blood. The Barn of Echoes. The night the barn opened became the night Sedalia lost its sleep. The storm that followed would be remembered in whispers long after every witness was buried. For what Dr. Samuel Harding and Thomas Caldwell saw within that barn could never be spoken aloud, without shaking the walls of faith itself. The lantern's flame trembled as Harding and Thomas stepped forward. Timothy stayed on the porch, still as the snow-covered fence posts around him. His face was unreadable, his small hands folded neatly in front of him. The barn door swung on its hinges, creaking with a sound that seemed too deliberate, like breath passing through wooden lungs. Inside, the smell hit them first. Not rot, not decay. Something colder. It was the smell of iron and earth, the scent of life interrupted. The horses stood frozen, their eyes wide and white, breath clouding in the air, muscles twitching beneath their hides as if held still by unseen hands. Not one moved when Harding entered. Not one made a sound. They simply stared. At the far end of the barn, the light revealed something drawn on the floor in dark, dried streaks. Circles and lines, symbols that twisted in geometric precision. They were not childlike doodles. They were careful, studied, constructed. Harding knew order when he saw it, and what lay before him was order shaped from madness. He stepped closer, his boots crunching over straw. The streaks were not ink. They were blood, and at the center of it all lay a lamb, its body untouched, its eyes open, staring straight up as though awaiting command. Around its neck was a thin rope tied in a perfect knot, one Harding recognized instantly. It was the same type of knot he had seen on the dead calves weeks before. "Dear God," Thomas whispered. "What is this?" Harding turned toward him, his voice low. "This is not God's work." The wind howled against the barn walls. Somewhere above, something shifted. A board creaked, dust fell. Harding lifted the lantern higher, the light flickering across the rafters. There, etched into the wood, were marks, dozens of them, tiny deliberate carvings. He could barely make them out, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized each one was a name. He traced a finger along the letters. Mary Fletcher, Henrik Larsson, Jacob Mills. He stopped breathing. The list continued, scrawled with a hand too small to belong to any grown man, and at the bottom of it, freshly carved, was Sarah Caldwell. Thomas stumbled backward, face pale. "That's my wife's name," he gasped. "He put her here. He put her here." Harding grabbed him before he could run outside. "Listen to me," he hissed. "If you go out there now, you won't come back." His eyes darted toward the door. Timothy still stood where they'd left him, a silent figure in the snow, watching, always watching. The doctor's pulse pounded in his ears. The rational mind that had survived war and plague was collapsing under the weight of what his eyes told him. No science could explain the stillness of the animals, the symbols that seemed to hum faintly as if alive, the way the very air inside that barn felt thick enough to drown in. He could feel something moving beneath it all, not in sound, but in sensation, like the heartbeat of the ground itself. Thomas wrenched free of Harding's grip and staggered toward the door. "I'll kill him," he rasped. "I'll kill that cursed child." "Stop," Harding said, his voice sharp. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Thomas didn't listen. He pushed open the door and stepped into the snow. The storm had begun to rise, wind tearing through the trees with a cry that sounded almost human. Lightning flashed, revealing Timothy still standing on the porch. But now the boy's eyes glowed faintly in the stormlight, a reflection that was not reflection at all. "Why?" Thomas shouted over the wind. "Why, you devil? What have you done?" Timothy blinked slowly, his voice carrying softly, impossibly through the storm. "You said I should help with the work, Uncle. I only did what was needed." The words froze Thomas in place. For a heartbeat, he could not speak. Then rage overtook him. He charged forward through the snow, shouting his wife's name, but halfway across the yard he stopped. His body stiffened, and a sound like a strangled cry tore from his throat. Harding ran toward him, the lantern whipping in his hand. Thomas stood rooted in place, eyes wide. The snow beneath his boots had turned dark, steaming in the cold. Harding dropped to his knees beside him. There was no wound, no blood on his clothing, but when he touched Thomas's chest, he felt nothing. No heartbeat. The man's eyes rolled upward, and he fell backward into the snow without a sound. The lantern fell beside him, the flame sputtering but not dying. Its light shone directly onto Timothy, who watched them both with eerie calm. "He was heavy," the boy said softly. "He didn't need to stay." Harding's breath came in ragged bursts. "You killed him," he whispered. Timothy tilted his head. He stopped himself. "I only counted," The doctor felt the world tilt. He stumbled backward, half crawling, half running toward the house. Inside, he slammed the door and leaned against it, gasping for breath. But even as he did, he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. Soft, measured, deliberate. 3 knocks, doctor. Timothy's voice came through the door. You should come back outside. The snow will cover him soon. Harding pressed his back against the door, every muscle trembling. He wanted to pray, but the words would not form. He wanted to run, but the air itself felt alive, listening. Then the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. When morning came, the sheriff found Harding in the Caldwell house, sitting at the kitchen table with a lantern burned down to its last ember. Outside, the snow lay smooth and untouched. There was no sign of Thomas Caldwell, only the footprints of a boy leading away from the barn toward the woods. Timothy was gone. Harding told the sheriff everything, though even as he spoke, he could see disbelief flicker behind the man's eyes. You're saying the child did all this? The sheriff asked. Killed them? Dug graves? Carved names in rafters? Doctor, you've been reading too many ghost stories. Harding didn't argue. He only said, find the boy before the thaw. If you wait, you won't find anything at all. But they didn't find him. The woods were searched for weeks. Dogs were brought in from as far as Jefferson City. Not a trace. No prints, no clothing, no body. It was as if the snow had swallowed him whole. Months passed. Spring came. The trees bloomed again. Life returned to Sedalia, but not the kind that healed. The land was different now. The soil yielded strange shapes when plowed. Bones of small animals arranged in patterns, sometimes in circles. The creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned ran dry, its bed lined with smooth stones carved faintly with symbols that no one could decipher. The Patterson chickens began laying eggs with shells pale blue like the boy's eyes. Dr. Harding left Sedalia that summer. He told no one where he was going. His journals, all 3 leather-bound volumes, were sent years later to a colleague in St. Louis with a short note attached. There are things born among us that study the living not out of hatred, but out of design. If the name Timothy Caldwell ever appears again in any record, seal it. Burn it, pray. The journals were sealed, hidden away, and for more than a century, no one spoke the name again. But every few years, when the snow falls heavier than it should, farmers near Sedalia swear they see a small figure standing at the edge of their fields. Pale hair, still eyes, hands folded behind his back, watching, counting, waiting. The journals unearthed. It was the summer of 1974 when Sedalia's forgotten ghost came crawling back into daylight. The war that tore through Missouri was a century gone, yet some scars never closed. Beneath the roots of an old sycamore tree behind what used to be the Caldwell farm, a team of local historians unearthed a small iron trunk, sealed tight with rust. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, the pages yellowed and the ink faded but still legible. The signature on the first page read, Dr. Samuel Harding, M.D. The discovery caused a quiet storm in the academic world. Harding had vanished from history after 1867. No one knew where he went or what became of him. But these journals, these trembling words written in precise, haunted handwriting, promised answers. They also whispered of something else, something the rational mind did not want to face. Professor Helen McCrae, a historian from the University of Missouri, was the first to open them. The first few pages were ordinary enough. Notes on medical practices, records of treatments, weather patterns, livestock health. Then came the entries that changed her breathing. The child observes death with understanding beyond years. He seeks not cruelty but comprehension. His curiosity is methodical. If God creates innocence, then I have met the exception. Helen sat in the dim light of her study, heart pounding as she turned the fragile pages. Each entry pulled her deeper into Dr. Harding's descent, a descent written not in the language of madness, but in that of cold scientific terror. She had studied 19th century medicine long enough to recognize a disciplined mind. Harding had not been delusional. He had been afraid. The third journal was different. Its ink was darker, its lines tighter, its handwriting almost frantic. The final pages were written in a trembling scrawl, words running into one another. He is not gone. The snow hides his steps, but the silence keeps him. They must never speak his name again. By the time Helen finished reading, The wind outside her office had begun to rise. The windows rattled faintly in their frames. She laughed nervously at her own unease, but part of her could not shake the sense that she had opened something that wanted to stay closed. She wasn't the only one reading those pages. The journals quickly found their way into the university's archives, catalogued under Rural Missouri Anomalies, 1866-1867. Within weeks, paranormal researchers, psychologists, and theologians from across the country requested access. Most dismissed it as hysteria, a small-town doctor's descent into superstition after too many losses. But a few saw what Helen saw. The details were too precise, the events too consistent. The first night Helen stayed late to transcribe Harding's writing, she noticed something strange. On the shelf across from her desk sat a small wooden carving. A crow, its wings folded, eyes carved with startling accuracy. It had been found inside the trunk with the journals, though the inventory log didn't mention it. She had assumed it was one of Harding's keepsakes, but when she lifted it to move it aside, she saw something carved on the underside of the base. TC, 1866. Her pulse quickened. Timothy Caldwell. The next day, she returned to the archives early. The crow carving was gone. That evening, she called her assistant, Mark Ellis, and told him they needed to visit the Caldwell property. The land was little more than a ruin now, half overgrown with weeds, the remnants of a barn sagging into itself, and a single stone chimney standing like a gravestone. They arrived just before dusk. The air was still, thick with humidity. No birds, no crickets. Only the faint whistle of wind through empty branches. Feels dead, Mark muttered, half smiling. Guess 100 years'll do that. Helen didn't answer. She was staring at the ground near the barn. Snow hadn't fallen in Missouri for months, yet the soil there was strangely pale, as if dusted with frost that refused to melt. She crouched down and brushed it with her hand. Beneath the surface, she felt smoothness. Stone, a pattern. Help me, she said. Together, they scraped away the dirt until the shape revealed itself. A perfect circle of flat stones. Smaller ones laid around it in deliberate order. At the center was a single larger stone, carved faintly with a mark that could have been a cross. Or something else. Helen's throat tightened. It's still here, she whispered. The same pattern Dr. Harding described. Mark frowned. You think the kid really made this? A kid? You sure Harding wasn't just seeing things? Helen didn't answer. She pulled from her bag one of the journal pages she had photocopied. The diagram on the page, the same symbol Harding had sketched from the barn floor, matched the stones exactly. That night, Helen dreamed of snow. She dreamed she was walking through an endless field, the air silent, her footsteps muffled. Ahead of her, a small figure stood by a tree, its head tilted. She couldn't see the face clearly. When she called out, the figure turned. Pale eyes, thin lips, the same child described in Harding's words. When she woke, her room was freezing. Her clock had stopped at 3:07 a.m. By the third week of research, the phenomena had spread beyond dreams. Mark began hearing scratching sounds near the archive shelves where the journals were kept. Another researcher swore she heard pages turning in an empty room. Twice, the university's night guard reported seeing a child standing in the hall after midnight, silent, barefoot, leaving no prints on the marble floors. The administration dismissed it all as imagination. Helen wasn't so sure. She returned to the Caldwell property one final time, this time alone. The air was different now, heavy, charged, as if the ground itself remembered too much. The barn had nearly collapsed, but she pushed inside anyway. There, beneath the broken rafters, she found something half buried under dust and hay. A small wooden figure carved in the shape of a lamb. Its eyes were empty sockets. Its surface was cold despite the heat of the day. She turned it over. TC 1867. That was when she heard it, the soft sound of counting. 1, 2, 3. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child's voice. Helen froze. The sound seemed to come from beneath her feet. She knelt, pressing her ear to the floorboards. The counting continued, steady and calm, reaching 12, then silence. Her flashlight flickered, and in that instant before it went dark, she saw footprints in the dust, small, bare, leading out of the barn and into the open field beyond. The next morning, Mark found her car abandoned at the edge of the property. The driver's side door was open. Her purse was inside. The journals were gone. Weeks later, the university received a package with no return address. Inside was the crow carving and a single page torn from one of the journals. The handwriting was unmistakable, Harding's, but the ink was fresh, the paper unstained by time. The child is not dead. He waits for those who read too deeply. The silence is his cradle. The package was sealed in storage, marked archive restricted. But some nights, when the wind moves just right through the old brick halls of the university, students swear they can hear a faint tapping sound from the locked basement room. Like a child counting softly in the dark, 1, 2, 3. And sometimes, if the air is cold enough, they say they see a shape by the window, small, still, watching. The return to Sedalia. By the spring of 1891, Sedalia had grown quiet again. The railroad had come through the county, bringing noise and strangers. Yet in the shadow of progress, old stories still moved like roots beneath the soil. The Caldwell farm was long abandoned. Its fences rotted, its barns collapsed, its wells sealed with stones. But people still spoke of it when the wind shifted. Children were warned not to wander near the creek, where frost clung to the reeds even in summer. Hunters swore they saw pale lights moving through the trees. And those who worked the new rail line said the fog that settled over that land at dawn was thicker than anywhere else in Missouri. The war was a memory, yet the ground still felt wounded. Dr. Samuel Harding had vanished nearly 20 years earlier. Some said he'd gone north. Others said the guilt had driven him to madness. Only a few believed what he'd written in those hidden journals, that a child named Timothy Caldwell had not died, but lingered somewhere between life and silence. In March of that year, Reverend Josiah Bell arrived in Sedalia to reopen the old church on Willow Road. He was a stout man, known for his unwavering faith, a preacher who believed every darkness could be conquered by the word. The townsfolk welcomed him, until he began asking about the Caldwell farm. They say a doctor lived here once. Bell asked an old carpenter as they repaired the church steps. A good man, but troubled. What became of him? The carpenter wiped the dust from his hands. Some men dig too deep into God's business, Reverend. Harding was one of them. Bell smiled politely, thinking it just superstition. But that night, as he unpacked his belongings in the parsonage, he found a scrap of paper tucked into an old hymnal left behind by the previous minister. It was brittle with age, written in elegant, deliberate handwriting. If the name Timothy Caldwell is spoken aloud, close the doors and do not listen for an answer. At first, Bell laughed it off. But the following week, while inspecting the churchyard, he saw something odd near the fence line. Small stones arranged in a perfect circle, each marked with a faint cross. He bent to touch one and felt a coldness that went straight through his gloves. That evening, he visited the town's records office. The clerk, a quiet woman with gray eyes, hesitated when he asked for files from 1866. "We don't keep those on open shelves," she said. "You'll need special permission." Permission from whom? She didn't answer. She simply nodded toward a locked cabinet in the back corner. Bell waited until she left, then forced the drawer open. Inside were a few faded documents, birth records, farm inventories, and a weathered note signed S. Harding. The words were smeared, but 3 remained clear enough to read, "He counts still." That night a storm rolled over Sedalia. Wind shook the church shutters, and the candles in the parsonage burned lower and lower, though no draft touched them. Bell dreamed of snow. He dreamed of a boy standing at the altar, hands folded, whispering numbers into the empty air. When he woke, the hymn book lay open on his chest. The page was blank except for a single word scrawled in fresh ink, Timothy. In the days that followed, the Reverend grew restless. Parishioners noticed he was distracted during sermons. He would stop mid-prayer, his gaze unfocused as if listening to something behind the church walls. He began keeping the doors locked even during daylight hours, saying it was to protect the sanctuary from vandals. But the truth was darker. Late one evening, Bell invited 2 elders from the congregation to join him at the old Caldwell property. He said he had seen lights there, lanterns perhaps, or trespassers. They agreed reluctantly. The night was cold and moonless. When they reached the field, the fog lay thick as wool. The barn was a skeleton of black timbers, half buried in vines. Belle carried a lantern. Its light wavered as they stepped inside. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and iron. On the far wall, barely visible through the dust, someone had carved words into the planks. The letters were shallow but clear. "Where things belong." One of the elders whispered, "That's what the boy said." "My father told me." "The one they found counting by the well." Belle turned sharply. "You know this tale?" The man nodded. "Every child here grows up hearing it. But no one says his name, not aloud." The Reverend's faith rebelled against fear. "A name has no power unless we give it," he said. He raised his voice and spoke it clearly into the dark. "Timothy Caldwell." The echo rolled through the barn, fading into the rafters. Silence followed. Then softly, like breath through the boards, came a sound. 1, 2, 3. The lantern flame quivered. Belle's throat tightened. He stepped back, heart hammering. The elders froze, their faces pale in the flickering light. The counting stopped at 12. Then from the shadows near the far corner, a small figure stepped forward. Barefoot, pale, eyes wide and blue as frost. "You called," the child said quietly. The lantern shattered. When dawn came, the townspeople found the barn door open, and the field covered in frost, though the air was warm. Of the Reverend and his companions there was no sign, only 3 sets of footprints leading into the barn, and a 4th, smaller pair leading out toward the creek. By noon, the prints were gone, melted into the soil. Sedalia buried the story again. The church doors stayed locked for years, until ivy swallowed the roof and the bell cracked from rust. Some said the Reverend's voice could still be heard in storms, praying against something that never stopped counting. And when children passed the field on their way to school, they sometimes found small wooden carvings left on the fence posts, birds, lambs, or human faces carved with strange precision. On the bottom of each one, a single set of initials, TC. The elders forbade anyone from touching them. But every so often a curious child would pocket one, thinking it harmless. And before the next frost, another grave would open in Sedalia. The boy who would not die. By the turn of the century, Sedalia had grown into a town of polished storefronts and quiet Sunday mornings. The war was a memory whispered only by the old. New families filled the valley with laughter and labor. Yet beneath the peace, the earth still remembered. The Caldwell land remained untouched, avoided by hunters and farmers alike. They called it the hollow ground, where frost bloomed out of season and sound died before reaching the trees. No one lived near it. No one dared. But sometimes at dusk, a faint light could be seen moving through the field where the barn had once stood. The older folks said it was the ghost of Reverend Bell, doomed to wander for speaking the forbidden name. The children, who never quite believed, would sneak to the edge of the property and listen. On still nights they swore they could hear counting. 1, 2, 3. The story might have ended there if not for Eleanor Harding, the granddaughter of Dr. Samuel Harding himself. In the spring of 1903, she arrived in Sedalia with a leather satchel and her grandfather's ring hanging around her neck. She was 34, educated in Boston, with the calm determination of someone chasing both history and redemption. She had grown up hearing the whispers, the doctor who vanished, the boy he wrote about, the deaths that followed. For years she had tried to find the missing journals, believing that somewhere in them lay the reason her family name had been erased from medical circles. When word reached her that a trunk of papers had been discovered in an old courthouse cellar, she came at once. What she found were fragments, pages dark with mold and water stains, but enough to piece together a legacy written in terror. Each word of her grandfather's handwriting spoke not of superstition, but of a cold, measured dread. He had written about the child as though documenting a disease that thought. "If evil wears the face of a child," he had written, "then it is not born of hell but of curiosity unchained." Eleanor read by candlelight in her rented room at the edge of town, her fingers trembling over each page. When she reached the passage that ended with the words, "He counts still," she closed the book and stared into the darkness. She had to see the land for herself. The next morning, she set out on horseback toward the southern valley. The road grew narrow, flanked by bare trees that whispered like restless tongues. As she neared the old Caldwell farm, her horse slowed. nostrils flaring. The air changed, colder, thinner. Even the sunlight seemed to dim. The farmhouse was gone, swallowed by weeds, but the stone chimney still stood like a monument to forgotten sins. Eleanor dismounted and walked the rest of the way, her boots crunching over the brittle grass. She stopped at what had once been the barn. Only fragments of walls remained, blackened by time. There, among the ruins, she found a small wooden figure half buried in the dirt. A bird, its wings broken. She turned it over and froze. Carved into its base were 2 letters. TC, her pulse quickened. She knelt, brushing away the soil around the carving. Beneath it, the ground was different, harder, smoother. She dug with her hands until her fingers touched stone. What she uncovered made her heart falter. A perfect circle of small, flat rocks set with precision. In the center, a single larger stone engraved with faint marks, almost erased by weather. But one line was still visible, the same symbol that appeared in her grandfather's drawings. A whisper rose behind her. It was faint, almost like wind through grass. Then, clear as a breath near her ear, came a voice. "Why do you keep looking?" Eleanor turned sharply. No one was there. Only the empty field and the shadows of trees moving in the breeze. Her throat went dry. "Who's there?" She called. Silence. Then, from the far side of the field, movement. A figure stepping from the tall grass. Small, barefoot, hair pale as the morning sun. The boy looked no older than 8. Eleanor's chest tightened. "You can't be real," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "You read his words." "You came anyway." Her knees weakened. The boy's voice was soft but steady, each syllable carrying the calm of someone who had never needed to raise his voice. "You're Timothy," she said. He nodded. "I was. What are you now?" He tilted his head. "Still learning." Her mind screamed to run, but her feet refused. "Why did you kill them?" "The children, the animals, my grandfather's friends, why?" The boy looked almost sad. "I didn't kill them." They stopped. They always stop. I wanted to see why. "You're not human." He blinked slowly. "Does it matter?" Eleanor's breath came in shudders. "What are you learning now?" He stepped closer. The ground seemed to hush beneath his feet. "How to stay." Her hand went to the silver cross around her neck. The air grew colder, her breath visible. "Stay where?" She whispered. "In them," he said simply. "In those who remember." He raised one small hand, palm up, and she saw what lay within. A small, smooth stone engraved with a perfect circle. The same one from the ground. "You wanted to understand him," Timothy said softly. "Now you'll understand me." The wind rose suddenly, tearing through the grass like a scream. The sky darkened, though no clouds moved. The stone in his hand began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Eleanor stumbled backward, shielding her face from the dust. When the storm of wind and silence passed, she was gone. The field lay empty, untouched, save for one new figure carved from wood lying where she had stood. A woman's face, eyes closed, mouth in a line of peace. On its base, the initials E.H. Weeks later. Farmers found her horse wandering near the creek, saddle torn, eyes wild. The sheriff searched the valley but found nothing except that carving. He buried it beneath the church steps where it remains to this day. By 1905, Sedalia stopped speaking her name, just as they had stopped speaking Timothy's. But the cold never left that land. Even in the heat of summer, a thin frost would gather on the stones near the old chimney. And at night, the air would carry a soft rhythm, almost too faint to hear. 1, 2, 3. And when it reached 12, the wind would die, the fields would still, and a voice, neither child nor groan, would whisper into the dark. He counts still. No one knows what became of Timothy Caldwell. Some say he was never a boy at all, but something that learned to wear the shape of one. Others say he is what remains when curiosity forgets to stop at mercy. But those who have walked that valley in the quiet hours of dawn swear they have seen him. Small, pale, hands folded neatly, eyes reflecting nothing, still watching, still counting, still waiting for someone to speak his name again.